Hello and welcome to episode 29 at the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I will be discussing China's claim that it is a socialist country and what it means for China and beyond. Xi Jinping claimed in a speech he gave in 2013 that China is undergoing an historical transformation that is penned under the title of Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. Xi has also claimed that Marx and Engels' theory of historical materialism and the Marxist-Leninist theory of dialectical materialism is alive and kicking, despite Fukuyama's claim that 1989 signified the end of history. However, Fukuyama has argued that China under Xi's leadership has moved away from being an authoritarian regime towards being a totalitarian regime. Xi's claim that historical materialism is underway is important for us to understand because it is claimed by Western media that Xi is playing the long game. What Western media and perhaps most Western politicians don't understand is that the so-called long game, as they report or speak of, is in fact historical materialism playing out in China and beyond. And they fail to grasp this fact because, in general, they either misunderstand how historical materialism works or refuse to engage with it because it's a Marxist concept. So, let's examine these Chinese characteristics in the context of historical materialism and assess whether Xi is correct to argue that socialism exists or is underway in China, or whether it is a brutal one-party dictatorship making false claims about socialism to protect the Marxist-Leninist Chinese Communist Party's interest. The assertion that there are Chinese characteristics to be taken into account for outsiders to understand what type of socialism is underway in China is important for many reasons, but here I'll give two. Firstly, and this is stating the obvious, Xi is confirming that it is a form of socialism. And secondly, that the Chinese model may not be suitable for other countries claiming to be socialist or wanting to become one. So, according to Xi, one-party systems such as Vietnam, Laos, North Korea and Cuba, as examples, will have their own characteristics that conditions their models of socialism. Marx wrote many things, but one thing he didn't produce was a blueprint for socialism and communism. That is up to us to create. That said, there are a few important points we should consider in this context, which are central towards Marxist thinking concerning the movement towards communism. One is the common ownership of the means of production. 2, the development of a classless society. And 3, the withering away of the state and its bloated bureaucracy. In 1917, the year of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the British socialist Sidney Webb wrote Clause 4, which was adopted into the Labour Party's written constitution a year later in 1918, which was after World War I had ended. Webb understood that 1918 would represent a great opportunity for radical change in Britain after the horrors of the war. Webb was the co-founder of the London School of Economics and an early member of the Fabian Society, founded in 1884, which was instrumental in founding the Labour Party in 1900. Webb was no Marxist. He sought to pursue democratic socialism, not full socialism, through reform, but Clause 4 contained the fingerprints of Marx. And this is what it says. Clause 4 is, and I quote, "to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry, and the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible upon the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and the best obtainable system of popular administration and control of each industry or service. Later in the 1990s, the Labour Party under Tony Blair's leadership removed Clause 4 from its constitution, thus removing any association with Karl Marx. Now, is the common ownership of the means of production an objective of the Chinese Communist Party, otherwise known as CPC? Well, the short answer to that is yes, or so say the CPC, but right now they claim to be in a different stage of historical development, which is detailed in the CPC's constitution, which was revised and adopted at the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China on October 24, 2017. And here is what they say. The basic line of the Communist Party of China in the primary stage of socialism is to lead all the people of China together in a self-reliant and pioneering effort, making economic development the central task, upholding the four cardinal principles, and remaining committed to reform and opening up, so as to see China become a great modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. So now the CPC claims that they are in the primary stage of socialism, and that socialism with Chinese characteristics underpins this phase of development. There are other forms of socialism worth discussing here that can be contrasted with the Chinese model. One in the Western systems is called democratic socialism, which is seen as a means towards socialism and is characterized as a mixed economy model. That is one based on a capitalist mode of production, but one where the state will redistribute wealth for social needs such as education, health, etc. On the face of it, China seems to represent or to resemble the market socialism model, which Yugoslavia used because China allows entrepreneurs to operate a system based on a capitalist mode of production. However, there are clear differences between market socialism and the primary stage of socialism underway in China. I had first-hand experience of the market socialism model when I spent time in the former Yugoslavia before it broke up in the 1980s. Market socialism is also a mixed economy model, whereby goods are exchanged on the market, and in the case of Yugoslavia, they exchanged goods with both the West and Eastern countries. However, Yugoslavia rejected both the Western system of capitalism and private ownership, and it rejected the state-centralized system of the Soviet Union. It was known as a non-aligned country. Its system was based on workers' cooperatives who were free to compete with each other on the market without direct state intervention, hence the term market socialism. China, however, relies heavily upon state-centralized control, but with a capitalist mode of production, and appears to be a classic example of state capitalism, although Xi rejects this characterization. For Xi and the CPC, state capitalism is not the same as socialism with Chinese characteristics, because they argue it is the primary stage of socialism, which will one day dissolve before communism is achieved. In January 2015, Xi gave a speech to the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee, where he explained that China is at a primary stage of socialism and will be so for some time to come. Xi acknowledged the strides China had made after 30 years of reform and the opening up of Chinese society. He also reminded the Political Bureau that China had made significant historic breakthroughs in productivity, which had raised people's living standards, but warned of a constantly changing world that could affect its development. And Xi said at the time, and I quote, "We should grasp new traits in new phases of development and stipulate guidelines in accordance with reality." Now, Xi also expressed how the CPC's ideology should be maintained throughout and be the guiding light of the party. At the 2015 meeting, Xi referred to the historic meeting 2 years earlier in 2013, when the Political Bureau convened for a meeting on historical materialism and said, and I quote, "Studying dialectical materialism and historical materialism will help CPC members get a better understanding of Marxist philosophy." Xi also reminded members that they embrace and promote core socialist values and adapt them towards the inevitable contradictions in the phases of development. Xi was adamant that China should not be judged by its gross domestic product in isolation from other realities. Rather, it should be judged by the transition it was undergoing in economic development. Such restructuring would have its problems, but the core socialist values she spoke of, he argued, would help to resolve these issues. She also spoke about China's commitment towards an ecological society, embracing new technologies for a greener environment. He impressed upon the members to take a holistic view of societal, evolutionary change to achieve the tasks ahead. And he also spoke about dialectical methods and how they can resolve complex issues, and said, "Experience is the best teacher." Now, I want to focus on one issue then raised in Xi's speech, which is the reference to developing an ecological society. In 2015, China was one of the heaviest polluters in the world. But by 2026, just 11 years later, things are looking radically different. Laurie Miller-Verter, a lead analyst at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, wrote an interesting article in February 2026 titled, "China's CO2 emissions have now been flat or falling for 21 months. The author states that this process began in March 2024, so the trend was positive for 2 years. Writing for the online journal Carbon Brief, the author acknowledged that, and I quote, "In 2025, emissions from fossil fuels increased by an estimated 0.1%, but this was more than offset by a 7% decline in CO2 from cement." And the author listed 3 other points in his key findings. The first point is this: CO2 emissions fell year on year in almost all major sectors in 2025, including transport 3%, power 1.5%, and building materials 7%. And the second point the author makes is this: solar power output increased by 43% year on year, wind by 14%, and nuclear 8%, helping push down coal generation by 1.9%. And the final point is this: energy storage capacity grew by a record 75 gigawatts, well ahead of the rise in peak demand of 55 gigawatts. And then the author summed up Chinese progress thus, and I quote, "This means that growth in energy storage capacity and clean power output topped the increases in peak and total electricity demand, respectively." Now, that is an impressive progress, which countries like the USA, for example, fail to grasp with its current imbecilic regime under Trump's failed leadership. On China's global television network, otherwise known as CGTN, there's a series of brief articles regarding the current form of development in China under the heading The Foundations. And one piece is titled, "What Does Path of Socialism with Chinese Characteristics Mean?" And they go on to offer an explanation of the type of socialist development underway in China, stating, and I quote, "In China's case, the situation is more nuanced. In the 1950s, when the Communist Party of China eliminated elements of exploitative classes and institutions, China began to enter the phase of building a socialist society as it needed to address the principal contradiction facing the society at the time, one between the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people and the backwardness of social production. The system was built entirely on the public ownership of production means and planned economy in accordance with the Marxist theory." In another piece titled "China's Commitment to Improving Its System and Governance, a Choice Made by History," they say this, and I quote, "In the struggle for independence and development, China has tried various systems, including a constitutional monarchy, a parliamentary system, a multi-party system, and a presidential system, but all ended up in failure. Eventually, China took socialism, a choice made by the people who have been determined to save the country from separation and manipulation by the old elite groups or being involved in endless partisan conflicts." On January 5, 2013, Xi gave a speech to the party's Central Committee. In his speech, Xi rejects the various labels that attempt to characterize Chinese model, such as capital socialism, state capitalism, and bureaucratic capitalism, and Xi states that these labels are completely wrong. And Xi therefore argues that, and I quote, "Socialism with Chinese characteristics is socialism. It is not any other sort of ism. The foundational, scientific principles of socialism cannot be abandoned. Only if they are abandoned would our system no longer be socialist. From first to the last, our party has emphasized that socialism with Chinese characteristics adheres to the basic principles of scientific socialism and is imbued with characteristically Chinese features bestowed by the conditions of the times. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is socialism, not any other ism." She says that the Chinese model is based on the absolute leadership of the Communist Party of China. So what she is reaffirming is the classic Marxist-Leninist view that the CPC is the vanguard party that has absolute authority over the direction and development of China. Now, one Marxist writer amongst many who have rejected Lenin's position of the vanguard party is the Caribbean writer C.L.R. James, who argued that workers can organize themselves without the authoritarian diktats of the party guiding them on every detail of life. James was a Trotskyist for many years, and like other Trotskyist writers, his books are largely unavailable in China. And that tells us much about socialism with Chinese characteristics, in that alternative views on Marxism and socialism and dissent in general is not tolerated. Xi promotes the socialist market economy and compels the party to adhere to the 4 cardinal principles established by Deng Xiaoping in 1979. The 4 cardinal principles are as follows. 1. Absolute commitment to the socialist path. 2. Upholding the people's democratic dictatorship. 3. Upholding the supreme leadership of the Communist Party of China. And 4. Adhering to Marxism, Leninism and Mao Zedong thought. Now, for the first principle towards a socialist path to be achieved, the party must reject capitalist ideology, even when the economic base and the transfer of commodities are based on a capitalist mode of production and the global market trade. The second principle, concerning upholding the democratic dictatorship, is a stern defense of centralized authority of the state bureaucracy. According to that principle, the party must work in the interests of the Chinese people, whatever that may mean. But to be in the service of the people, surely the party should listen carefully to how the people express their interests and views, however different they are from the Communist Party of China. But there's no room for dissenting voices, and to call it a democratic dictatorship is an oxymoron of the highest kind. As far as I'm concerned, the third principle concerning upholding the authority of the CPC is no different from the second, as is the fourth principle concerning upholding Marxist-Leninist and Mao Zedong's thoughts. Deng Xiaoping's influence is everywhere here. Even the term socialism with Chinese characteristics was coined by Deng in 1982. The term socialist market economy was coined by Jiang Zemin 10 years later in 1992, which built upon Deng's thoughts. Earlier, I referred to market socialism, which was the model used in the former Yugoslavia. But the Chinese socialist market economy system is different. So, considering Yugoslavia was a Marxist-Leninist state, and China is also, why does China prefer their system? Firstly, like market socialism or democratic socialism, which is advocated mainly in Western capitalist countries, the socialist market economy model is also seen as a first step towards socialism, and broadly speaking, this aligns with the first cardinal principle of the path towards socialism. Even though it was Jiang Zemin who introduced the term socialist market economy, it was Deng Xiaoping who provided the fundamentals of it when he broke with Mao's fixation on cultural and political changes, with Deng focusing on a market system that would generate wealth. The socialist market economy model, however, is in historical terms temporary because it is seen to be the path towards socialism, so it is a means to an end. The contrast with market socialism, the type Yugoslavia used, is then vastly different from the Chinese model, as I've already pointed out. But even though the Chinese model is at this stage a mixed economy type of public ownership with private commercial enterprise, the state nevertheless asserts its authority over the entire system, whereas the market socialism model does not, hence the numerous workers' collectives that were once in Yugoslavia. They saw centralized economic planning as an obstacle towards achieving socialism. What Xi was doing in his 2013 speech is reaffirming the historical changes from Deng Xiaoping's and Jiang Zemin's time in office, but not totally abandoning the thoughts of Mao Zedong. Crucially, Xi pays his respects to Deng by saying this: Comrade Deng Xiaoping once made a profound observation, and then goes on to quote Deng directly, saying, and I quote, "Our modernization must flow from Chinese realities. No matter if it is a revolution or construction, we should pay attention to, learn from, and borrow from foreign experience. However, copying other countries' experiences and models has never been successful. We have learned a lot in this respect." In Xi's speech, there's almost an air of a Methodist minister speaking or preaching passionately from his pulpit to his flock. Xi's language is almost religious in tone, urging party members to have faith, xinjiang, in the path towards socialism. He insisted that genuine communists must be devout, jianzheng, in their everyday work practice. Members must sacrifice, xisheng, everything, be disciplined and commit to the word of the party and never deviate from the 4 cardinal principles, and even is insisting that ideals should reach higher than heaven. 故名理想高有天. It's all intensely dramatic. There's even a parable of sorts that Xi refers when he tells members a story and relates it to the type of socialism underway in China today. And Xi says, "I recall the story written in Zhuangzi's Autumn Floods, where it says," and I quote, "Perhaps you've never heard about the young boy of Shuling, who went to learn the Handan walk. He hadn't mastered what the Handan people had to teach him, and when he forgot his old way of walking, so he had to crawl all the way back home." And Xi reminds his audience that we must never, well, not ever, go to Handan to learn to walk and forget our native stride. Instead, we have taken Marxism and cynicized it. That is socialism with Chinese characteristics. Learning the walk of Handan is both a Chinese proverb and idiom, which has an important lesson to be learned, which is do not imitate others at the expense of your original thoughts, and has its roots in Taoist philosophy. To push his point home and justify the authority of the CPC and its need to be cohesive, a cohesive ideological force, Xi references the lessons from the collapse of the USSR, the collapse that led G.W.H. Bush to announce that a new world order had come into being, which was articulated by Fukuyama in his end of history theory. He says that Xi says that the repudiation of both Lenin and Stalin was an act of historical nihilism. Now, just think about that for one moment, and the millions of deaths committed by the Stalinist regime. And for Xi, Stalin is seen as a heroic figure. In 3 previous episodes, I discussed Marx's theory of historical materialism, asking whether it is still relevant today, and the CPC obviously believe it is. And here is what Xi says, and I quote, "There are people who believe that communism is an unattainable hope, or even that it is beyond hope in full, that communism is an illusion. This touches upon whether historical materialism or historical idealism is the proper frame through which to view our world affairs. The fundamental reason why some of our comrades have weak ideals and faltering beliefs is that their views lack a firm grounding in historical materialism." The CPC's Central Committee produce a bi-monthly online website called Xi, where in 2022 they reaffirmed the Chinese form of development underway. On that website, and filed under the lengthy title uphold socialism with Chinese characteristics and strive in unity to build a modern socialist country in all respects, it reproduced an equally lengthy piece from the selected readings of Xi Jinping Volume 1, where there are references to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence: party discipline, national rejuvenation, successes in tackling poverty, ecological conservation, socialist modernization through reform, and much more. Xi also commits to the theory of 3 represents, created under the leadership of Jiang Zemin in 2000. Ji-Hung Kwan, a research fellow at the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry, explains the 3 represents theory thus, and I quote, "The 3 represents theory emphasizes that it is the Communist Party that represents advanced productivity, advanced culture, and the fundamental interests of the overwhelming majority of the people of China. It represents a significant departure from the traditional Marxist dogma whereby the Communist Party is supposed to represent the proletariat only. If the Chinese Communist Party really were to become a party representative of all the people, by definition it would no longer be a Communist Party. Thus, rather than being a cosmetic reform, the 3 represents theory may actually change the Communist Party fundamentally." After Mao was removed from power, Deng became the General Secretary of the CPC and quickly announced his cat theory of development. And Deng famously said, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white. As long as it catches mice, it's a good cat." Now this all sounds abstract, but Deng's statement was incredibly radical and practical because it prioritizes economic development over socialist ideology. It led the way for opening up China to a capitalist economic system, while socialist thought would adjust to incorporate this new era of development. With reference to the 3 represents theory, Jiang Zemin argued that the CPC's role is no longer there simply to prioritize the workers, but now to include advanced market forces in their priority, and even allow capitalists and entrepreneurs to become Communist Party members. And these are often referred to as red capitalists, which is one reason that many writers in the West categorize China as state capitalism, which, as I said earlier, which Xi rejects. On the Chinese Global Television Network website, they also pose the following question: what does staying true to the original aspiration and founding mission mean for the CPC? And they offer a quotation from Xi, which is thus, and I quote, "The original aspiration and the mission of Chinese communists is to seek happiness for the Chinese people and rejuvenation for the Chinese nation." Now, for a party who places a huge emphasis on scientific analysis and indeed scientific Marxism, as opposed to humanist Marxism, it seems strange to refer to happiness because it's such a woolly idea and impossible to use, I would argue, in relation to a nation. Even Erich Fromm, a humanist Marxist whom I greatly admire, has spoken about happiness, where Fromm says, and I quote, "Happiness is the indication that man has found the answer to the problem of human existence, the productive realization of his potentialities, and thus simultaneously being one with the world and preserving the integrity of his self. In spending his energy productively, he increases his powers, He burns without being consumed. Now, it was Aristotle who presented a discourse on happiness, otherwise known as eudaimonia, and who tied it in with virtue. And all discussions on happiness has followed on from that. In relation to China's scientific approach to socialism, it is believed that the political theorist Wang Hunin developed the term scientific outlook on development, who was also instrumental in creating the three represents theory I mentioned earlier. The scientific outlook on development is seen as instrumental in the historical process of historical materialism, which is often referred to as scientific socialism. And that term has its roots in Friedrich Engels' book titled Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, published in 1892, where Engels disparages utopian socialists as dreamers, whereas scientific socialism, outlined by Marx, had its foundations in the real material elements of life. Wang Hunin also adhered closely to the concept of neo-authoritarianism, which translates into a strong, centralized leadership that oversees the gradual reform of Chinese society. Overall, the CPC believes that without neo-authoritarian rule, chaos would ensue, as markets would be deregulated with no common purpose other than a naked return on profits. This is closely linked to the Chinese concept called the Socialist Harmonious Society, which rests upon neo-authoritarian rule that regulates the capitalist market in China, which they say bring benefits to the people. If you've enjoyed this or other episodes, then please click like or leave a comment or even follow me. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.